Good afternoon, students. I am your instructor, Rosemary Mutia. This afternoon, we will tackle about the new topic, which is all about on how to identify and evaluate work hazard in shielded metal arc and welding. By identifying the work at hazards involves preparedness to control before proceeding with the job task in order to prevent accidents and maintain safe work environment. Welding is a hazardous workplace activity which exposes to employees or even workers to health and safety risk. When we talk about hazardous or hazard, it has a many different definitions. But when talking about workplace safe and health, hazard is any potential source of damage to a worker or harm to someone or something. When we talk about harm, it is as a physical injury or damage to health. As such, welding is proved to be a highly dangerous occupation, particularly if safety measures is ignored. That's why at the end of this lesson, you will be able to learn on how to identify work hazards and evaluate on what should or must do in order to at least lessen in having a varieties of hazards within the area. Now, let's talk about the most common welding hazard. We have the first one, electric shock. Electric shock occurs when the welder touches two metals that have a voltage between them, which means they are part of a circuit that the electric circuit runs through them, which cause on having an electric shock. In order to avoid this electric shock, welders should wear a personal protective equipment, such as safety gloves or welding gloves to protect from electric shock, or even touching hot parts, flying metals or sharp, or even arc rays. Of course, avoid touching the electrode with skin or even wet clothing. Why? It's because if you are using wet clothing and you are touching an electric, there is a tendency that you will experience an electric shock. And for us to avoid this to happen, we need to not to touch the electrode if we are in a wet clothing, to avoid injuries or even death. Now let's proceed to the second one. Fumes and gases. Its prolonged exposure to welding fumes and gases can cause a number of health problems. A toxic, hazardous substances in which if a welder will not or would not use a proper personal equipment, specifically the respiratory mask, he or she could possibly have a health problems. And in order to avoid this, a welder should wear an appropriate or approved respiratory mask, as what I've said earlier. Ensure proper ventilation and exhaust systems in place, and of course, clean based metals before they begin to weld. Because if you are using an unused metals during welding or when welding, there is a tendency that there are a lot of fumes and gases will occur. Let's proceed to the third one. We have fire and explosion. Flammable materials around the working area are the number one cause of fire. Yes. In a workplace or in a work area or during welding, flammable materials should not be placed in working area. Why? Because it can cause fire and explosion. That's why, in order to prevent fire and to stay safe, welders should remove flammable materials from the work area, or what I've said earlier, do not place it near. The second one is to use fire-resistant materials to cover flammable materials if they can't be moved. The third one, we have, you should always be aware and should always be know where is the fire alarm or fire extinguisher is placed for you to be able to easily find or locate those important thing if there is a fire in the area. Now let's proceed to the next one. We have exposure to ultraviolet and infrared radiation. Long-term exposure to arc flashes during welding. UV light produces when welding with proper personal protective equipment. Of course, UV light occurs when a welder would not use a personal protective equipment, such as wearing a welding helmet. Because if a welder would not use or wear a proper personal protective equipment, specifically the welding helmet during welding, he or she might can get a painful condition called arc eye. And in order to avoid this condition, always consider to wear a personal protective equipment to prevent this condition called arc eye and to prevent on having loss of vision. Now, let's proceed to the last one. We have burns. Burns is usually the most common hazard in the workplace in welding. Why? It's because since welding involves electricity, so there is always like lights or sparks is present in welding. Burns caused by just exposing your skin to the extremely hot welding arc, and they can even penetrate through clothing. It occurs usually when welders think they can skip taking precautions for a few quick welds. Now, burns is usually occurs when welder would not wear or consider in wearing a personal protective equipment. That is how important personal protective equipment is. Because if you are not wear a personal protective equipment, you are exposed to a hot welding arc, which can cause you to have a burn. And so to avoid this, like what I've said, always wear a personal protective equipment such as lightweight welding jacket. Now let's talk about how important to identify and evaluate work hazard is. It's very important because because the most reason of it, because it gives you a healthy or safety measures. Because if you can able to identify and evaluate work hazards, you can able to prevent variety of hazards within the area. You can help yourself to avoid injuries or even accidents and death. Safety measures. Now let's talk about how much important personal protective equipment is. As the example, the following personal protective equipment mentioned, we have respirator, protective clothing, gloves or safety gloves, welding mask, and protective boots. Safety measures: always wear a personal protective equipment in a workplace to avoid variety of hazards. Of course, in all workplace that involves hazardous activity, there's a need to consider or wear a personal protective equipment for you to be able to avoid variety of hazards like injuries, accidents, or even death. Okay, that's all for this afternoon. Hopefully that you learned something from my discussion. Thanks for listening. God bless you all.